Okay, good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Today I'm joined by three of my colleagues. Richard Kraemer is a fellow at FPRI's Eurasia program, and he's formerly Senior Program Officer for Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey at the National Endowment for Democracy. You can see Richard's full bio on our website at fpri.org. Reuf Bajrovic is the Vice President at the US-Europe Alliance in Washington, and previously he served as President of the Emerging Democracies Institute in Washington and President of the Civic Alliance political party in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Tanya Domi is an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and is an affiliate faculty member of the Harriman Institute. Richard Kraemer has written an extensive report for FPRI entitled Serbia's Authoritarian Trajectory Under Russian Influence, where he argues that Serbia has become a Russian and Chinese ally run by a semi-authoritarian government that proactively pursues ideologically irredentist territorial expansion in the Western Balkans. Today, we have gathered to discuss this report, discuss the contents of this report. We have pasted the link to the report in the message box on your right-hand side. So I encourage everyone to check it out if you haven't already. I will ask Richard to speak for a few minutes and tell us what's in the report, what the main Western policy challenges are, and then I will turn it over to Reuf and afterwards to Tanya for their commentary. I want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature to submit their questions at any time during the discussion. And after these initial remarks, I will get to all the questions that will come in. So please feel free to use this Q&A feature and be as active as you would like. I will do my best to get to all the questions. With that, thank you again to our speakers for joining us, and thank you to our audience. Richard, I'll turn it over to you.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Kraemer. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues at FPRI for their support in the publication of my report, Serbia on the Edge, and for putting together this event. I want to thank my dear friend, Reuf Bajrovic, and Tanya for joining us today on the panel, and all of you for being here. Maya did an excellent job. I'm going to restate the report thesis because I like it. I think it's very succinct. That Serbia, under President Aleksandar Vučić, is indeed a stalwart Russian and China ally, run by a semi-authoritarian government that is proactively pursuing ideologically irredentist expansion in the Western Balkans. So why did I feel the need to write this report now? Well, and go through a few of them. I mean, fundamentally, what I would like to see, and I think what I hope that everyone on the call would like to see, is a genuinely democratic, pluralistic, and economically prosperous Serbia. That would be of great benefit to the security as well as the economy of the transatlantic community. It would be of even greater benefit, the stability and prosperity that would come with that realization for the Western Balkans. Of course, most of all, it'd be of the greatest benefit to the Serbian people. Now, realizing that is difficult under the SNS party and Aleksandar Vučić. And unfortunately, he, along with some other political leaders that have been elected in recent years in Central and Southeastern Europe, have been trending authoritarian. And we see this in a variety of spheres, one particularly in respect to restrictions on press freedom in some of these countries, Hungary being another violator of what I consider to be a very fundamental right. And their proclivities towards authoritarian adversaries like Russia and China, in turn, open doors where they connect with like-minded anti-democratic actors in the region. And their presence and their interventions are malign and fundamentally contrary to those interests and principles of the transatlantic community. I've been alarmed by Syria's military buildup over the last few years. It's especially disconcerting at a time when RS leader Milorad Dodik has been stirring the secessionist pot, regrettably, once again, and potentially fomenting violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Belgrade's relationship with Beijing in the past few years has been on an astounding rise, and the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party has interventions and has presence in Serbian industry, in telecommunications, and in technological sectors, then expands, whereby China has increasing influence in Serbia's politics and by extension its society. As it embeds itself, we need to be especially watchful because its extraction, should Serbia choose to go that route someday, will be extremely difficult and it will have ramifications on security for the greater Euro-Atlantic space. Now, as a caveat, I'd like everyone to know that this report was written and it was prepared for publication prior to Russia's invasion and its aggression towards Ukraine. That is not addressed in this report. Fortunately, we're having this event today to be able to speak about the immense consequences of this tragedy, how that's going to affect Serbia, how it's going to affect a potential renewed Vučić presidency. And of course, with that, we'll be able to talk about the elections a little bit during the discussions today as well. But in the end, the purpose of this report and my hope is that for those like me who desire to see a democratic and stable and prosperous Serbia, we'll be able to use it to inform discussions around that. Because as things stand at this point, I'm really hopeful about Serbia's democratic trajectory unless there is a real change, both within the country and as well as with those in Brussels, Berlin, London, and Washington that would like, as I do, to see Serbia become a fully responsible and welcome member of a broader transatlantic community and its institutions. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned writing this report was because of Serbia's current military posture. And Vučić, I believe, has positioned Serbia to take advantage of opportunities to potentially expand Belgrade's writ, if not potentially Serbia's borders, to ethnic Serbian communities in neighboring states. I will note the massive increase in military expenditure. Serbia's military budget went up 43% in 2019, and in 2021, it peaked at 1.5 billion, which is a significant amount considering Serbia's GDP. There's been significant armament acquisition, everything from Chinese Rainbow attack drones used in European airspace for the first time in Serbia, air defense systems purchased from Russia as well as from France. And there are reports of negotiations with the Israelis for anti-tank weaponry and with the Turks for their increasingly popular and effective Bayraktar drones. What I sense, and it's a gut feeling, and I write this in the report, but it reminds me a little bit of the armament acquisition that we saw going on in Azerbaijan for a number of years, that I believe played a role in the tragic war that was fought over Nagorno-Karabakh again in 2020. Shades are there. That worries me. Particularly when the government of Belgrade decides to show its belligerence, as was the case in fall of last year, where upset with certain developments in Kosovo, armored personnel carriers were deployed to the borders and Serbian MiG jets were flying along it. Vučić even went so far to make somewhat sort of worrying, threatening remarks directed towards NATO General Secretary Jan Stoltenberg at the time. And then throughout all this, there's been a rise in ultranationalistic and caustic rhetoric. Particularly guilty is Minister of Interior Alexander Vulin, who last year called for the consolidation of the quote-unquote Serb world, further stating that the task for this generation of politicians is to unite Serbs wherever they live. This fall also saw the new Serb Unity Day celebrations with parades and whatnot on the streets of Belgrade. Attending, of course, was President Alexander Vučić, along with his approving gaze was that of Minister Vulin's, and Milorad Dodik was in attendance as well, stating that day, "Our country is not Bosnia-Herzegovina, it is Serbia." This kind of remarks were apparently received with favor in Belgrade. It was in November of that same year that the national budget apportioned funds to support RS municipal governments in Banja Luka and elsewhere. So where does this come from? Well, it's the Greater Serbia ideology, and many of you on this call are more familiar with its toxicity than perhaps I, because you've had to experience it firsthand. I define Greater Serbia as a chauvinistic and irredentist ideology that advocates the unification of all ethnic Serbs under one rule. Its fulfillment, therefore, can only be realized with the incorporation of all Balkan lands currently and historically populated by ethnic Serbs. Now, through the 19th and 20th centuries, the Greater Serbia ideology proved to be an ever-dependable motivator for political action and, sadly, too often political violence. The status of Greater Serbia in the 21st century is undiminished. It is a singular imperial ambition, and it's remarkable how it perseveres and serves as a guiding inspiration. And for a political operative, it's an excellent go-to catalyst to get people mobilized. The ascent of the Serbian the Progressive Party, the SNS, to the helm of political power in Belgrade has witnessed a quiet regression to the political mindset of the Milosevic years. And while the authoritarian and expansionist policies of Milosevic were overt, I argue that Vučić he's smarter than that. He's covert. There's a transatlantic veneer that he likes to show to the West, to those capitals beyond Belgrade, beyond Serbia, while domestically he presents himself as, well, domestically he wrests control in an authoritarian manner and sending beyond Serbia's borders a message that somehow this is going to allow Serbia to be a better guarantor of regional security. I don't really see this as being an effective way forward. I would actually argue that it's time for Serbs to consider amongst themselves a new national identity or a different kind of national narrative, one that recognizes the accomplishments, the character, and the strengths historically and presently of the Serbian people, but one that also encompasses a broad acknowledgement of past crimes committed against humanity. I believe this is essential if Serbia is ever to become a democratic and open society. Other democracies, certainly Western ones, have done their own share of bad things that can be termed as atrocities or crimes against humanity in the past. And for us to go forward as nations, we've had to reconcile ourselves with those sins that were committed by our forefathers. I think that would be of exceptional benefit to Serbia today. Generating a national identity that is based on citizenry and that strives for inclusive communities, rather than one that is exclusively focused, primarily focused on ethnicity and religious confession. I'm very well aware how difficult, complex, and gravely dangerous this is. The idea of crafting or even modifying this narrative, much less rejecting it. I would like to at least put forward that a good step would be that Serbian political elites at least politically discourage discourse around Greater Serbia in serious political fora, and that they robustly address, in concert with civil society, means by which they can enhance the sense of recognition, inclusion, and appreciation of Serbian citizens who are not ethnically Serbian, nor do they want to be identified ethnically. Turning to Serbia's independent media space, it's regrettably closing. Reporters Without Borders and Freedom House have been consistent in recent years in monitoring what has been an alarming press decline. Everything from state, private sector media capture to threats being made against courageous, brave, and independent journalists. Of particular concern for me and others, including my colleague Alvin Sibera, last year we wrote an article for Just Security in which we included reporting on what was happening between negotiations of a Czech company called PPF and its subsidiary Telenor and Serbia Telecom, the state-owned telecommunications business, if you will, and cable provider. As part of their negotiations, documents were leaked indicating that the parties recognized that a key benefit to an agreement would be the crushing, if you will, of Serbia Broadband, a competitor, which is also a cable provider and competitor to Serbia Telecom. What's particularly worrying about this in respect to the freedom of press in Serbia is that Serbia Broadband is affiliated with United Group, which owns Serbia N1. Reporters Without Borders describes Serbia N1 as the only big independent television station in the country. Thus, the grave concern and speculation was that given that N1 reports accurately, honestly, and independendly, they're outside of the control of the current SNS government in Belgrade, unable to help, or should I say, help N1 in its reporting and what kind of message it wishes to put out there. It's conceived of as a threat. We'll see how this competition between these various entities play out. I believe that we will know more after the elections on Sunday. The government in Belgrade's interest in dominating isn't restricted simply to Serbia, but there is a regional angle as well. In July of last year, Telekom Serbia's pay TV affiliate, Arena Sport, purchased the broadcast rights for English Premier League at 6 times of its current licensing agreement. That's 6 times more than what's being currently paid. That's remarkable. What's even more interesting is that the capital that was raised for this purchase was through the National Bank of Serbia's bond issuance for this very initiative. Why? Well, once again, it's to better control messaging. And the idea being that as Premier League is extremely popular and broadly watched throughout the region, in countries like Slovenia, like Croatia, like Bosnia-Herzegovina, where N1 also has affiliates and news services, that by getting people to watch Premier League on given channel extends to they're watching that channel more often, which will have its own news programming that will be under control of Telekom Serbia and by extension, the Serbian state. I don't want to, not to be hyperbolic, but I think very often those of us that are desirous of political transition in a lot of countries democratic transition or democratic consolidation tend to not appreciate just how important it is that press freedom is ultimately maintained. And if you have any questions about that, look into the recent Levada poll that came out regarding Russians' opinions of Vladimir Putin and the invasion in Ukraine. And that will tell you a great deal about the power of media, particularly when it's controlled by an authoritarian state and how that impacts public opinion and understanding. Thus, by extension in Serbia, if we consider it as such, you're leaving your citizenry extensively disempowered because they don't know the truth. And if they don't have facts in as objective manner as possible, it's difficult for them to effectively participate in democracy and determine their own destinies for their families and their communities. It also isolates them because essentially you have much of Europe watching the vast majority of Europe rather, watching what's happening with Ukraine in horror. Whereas if you read a number of Serbian media articles, as I have over the past month, as well as television broadcasts, there's a very, very different picture being painted as to what's happening in Ukraine. And it's one that is more in line with the Kremlin, the vision and propaganda than reality. So speaking of Russia, I'll turn briefly to Serbian-Russia relations. Historically, it's a unique relationship, very fraternal, but it's been very tenacious when you kind of dig into it a little bit. And I don't think it's especially different right now. I think the reason for that is I believe that lasting alliances are built on shared values and perceptions. I mean, 2 parties in a community or more, if they have a common worldview, are more likely to be able to work together. I would argue that Russian and Serbian elites have a very, very common worldview, as do large segments of their respective publics. The sense of victimhood, the aggravation over lost empire, a common past of consistent autocratic/monarchical rule. Ultranationalism pervades through much of their political cultures. Social conservatism also prevails throughout much of many social currents. And confession or religious identity, namely with the Russian Orthodox Church or the Serbian Orthodox Church, this relation to the church is seen as a core aspect of identity and of society. Accordingly, there's close cooperation between the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian government on one hand, and the Serbian Orthodox Church on the other. The Serbian Orthodox Church is a primary influencer in Serbian politics and life. It is very highly regarded. Putin understands this, and the Serbian Orthodox Church has shown itself to be a very reliable and loyal agent of the Kremlin in Serbia at times when, under President Alexander Vučić, he has pursued policies that were deemed not to be in Russia's best interest by President Vladimir Putin, who would go so far to very clearly make that message heard in Belgrade. It's important because Russia sees Serbia as an asset. I mean, arguably, both leaders in Serbia as well as in Russia would like to see Serbia become the preeminent future, because it helps them project their strategic interests more effectively. And those interests pretty much involve rolling back NATO presence and activity in the region. Serbia is also important for Gazprom. The Serbian Stream pipeline system brings gas from Turk Stream not only to Serbia, but beyond into Hungary and to other European markets. Serbia stands as a regional platform whereby anti-democratic actors and pro-Russian actors are able to disseminate anti-Western narratives and propaganda. those actors or those agents of influence being authoritarian leaning politicians, crony capitalists, the Serbian Orthodox Church, reactionary civil society, and indeed even paramilitaries, not simply in Serbia, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and in Montenegro. All of this is designed to position Serbia as having a key role in inhibiting the further transatlantic integration of other Western Balkan states. And that is a key aspect of Russia's long-term strategy, I argue, for the region. I'll touch briefly on Serbian-Chinese relationship. Those of you who have been watching Serbia regularly, perhaps you were as somewhat shocked as I was back in March of 2020 as COVID was spreading around the globe, and the Chinese had offered, by comparison to the Europeans, a pretty limited amount of assistance. Nonetheless, President Vučić felt compelled in a press conference to state the following: European solidarity does not exist. This was a fairy tale on paper. We expect a lot and have the highest hopes and the only ones who can help us in this difficult situation. And that is the Republic of China. We ask China for everything. Now, to be fair, as time went by, the Chinese did up their assistance regarding the COVID emergency in Serbia and elsewhere. And for example, they provided their share of the Sinopharm vaccine, which played a role in Serbia's vaccine diplomacy of the previous year. Serbia is also a key ally in the Belt and Road Initiative. If you combine the infrastructure projects that are Chinese-led right now in Serbia with foreign direct investment from that same country, it has the highest level of PRC, People's Republic of China, engagement in the Western Balkans at a whopping $11 billion. Now, to put that in comparison, many of you know Viktor Orban and Xi Jinping have a good relationship. Hungarian-Chinese relationships right now are doing quite well. They only have 4.87 billion in Hungary, a bigger economy and a wealthier economy. So this 11 billion is not insignificant. Nor insignificant is the fact that the Chinese loans to Serbia right now amount to 12% of its GDP. These investments have been in a number of sectors: heavy manufacturing, steel, copper processing, tire manufacture. Huawei has an exceptional presence. It recognizes Serbia as a node, if you will, on its digital Silk Road, and it's building Serbia's 5G network. Serbia, during the Trump administration, was so enamored that it actually went so far as to reject President Trump's 5G clean network, despite the otherwise warm relations, I would argue, between that White House and the SNS leadership. There's the Smart City Initiative, whereby Chinese firms are working with municipalities throughout Serbia to help them in their data information collection and management. And Huawei has been working also on the Safe City project, some of you may have heard of, whereby in addition to other means of technological support to Serbia's Ministry of Interior, as well as its law enforcement agencies, it's installed 1,100 facial recognition security surveillance cameras around the nation's capital. Why does China do all this? What are they getting in return? Well, they have a new market. They also have access to regional markets and beyond. Serbia has been generous in its support for China in various international fora, such as the UN, when it comes to issues of Tibet and the Uyghur genocide. And Serbia is basically offering, there's a geographic advantage. China has a staging ground, whether it's for intelligence or influence operations. They're able to be run out of Serbia quite effectively and without any harassment or molestation. And this is part of China's overall aim. Unlike Russia, which would like to see the Western Balkans remain somewhat, not too unstable, sufficiently unstable so those nations are not able to effectively integrate into entities like NATO or like the European Union or other transatlantic bodies, China would prefer to see more regional stability. The bottom line is that the more stability for them, the easier it is to get goods from various Adriatic ports to those markets in Southeastern Europe and beyond on the continent. I've spoken for 20 minutes in. I'll very briefly outline the basis of what I argue needs to be a new approach from the West and others who wish to see Serbia move towards a democratic trajectory rather than an authoritarian one. Given Serbia's closeness right now with Moscow and with Beijing, I think that we need to recognize Serbia as a diffuse threat. The capacity for interventions, for influence, so many activities that are contrary to the vision that the Euro-Atlantic community has for a democratic and unified Europe. are possible because of this relationship with Moscow and Beijing, and they need to be diminished. I think one good way to go forward is to recognize that, as I believe I've seen it, that there's very much a quid pro quo understanding between Belgrade on one side and Moscow and Beijing on the other. And that has been evidence, as I indicated previously, that Russia makes it very clear when Vučić is pursuing policies it does not like. Vučić plays nice, Moscow plays nice. Thus, I think conditionality needs to be much, much more front and center when we're talking about how we, as in the West, when we talk about how we engage governments in Belgrade. And that the message to Serbian elites need be that they demonstrate their understanding that the virulent nationalism of Greater Serbia must be surrendered if they're to feasibly one day ascend to EU membership. And indeed, I'll go so far to say that the appropriate level of condemnation and steps towards isolating Serbia may well spur that kind of attitudinal shift that we would like to see, so that democratic ambitions and Serbs that hold those democratic ambitions can realize them for the sake of their country and its future. And if ignored, I'm a big fan of looking at return on investment. If you're pouring a bunch of money into somewhere and you're not getting the results you see, in these times where we're going to be facing economic downturns, we in the West need to think very carefully about how much financial support and other aids we're going to give a recalcitrant government, rather than those states that have earnestly shown their commitment and desire to be part of our greater Euro-Atlantic community as a democratic member. And with that, I thank you, and I'll give it to our panelists.
Thank you, Richard. Let me just ask you to keep an eye on your microphone. There seems to be some interference. I will turn it over now to Reuf Bajrovic for his commentary, and then to Dr. Tanya Domi, and then I will get to everybody's questions. We have quite a bit to go over. I think Richard did such a great job outlining some of these key points that he has gone over in his report. Reuf?
Thank you very much. Regards to everyone, everybody watching us online. I'm going to dive right into the Serbian-Chinese and Serbian-Russian relationship. I think that is the single most important part of this report, because Richard has outlined what many call attention. There's a lot of discrepancy between what the Chinese want in Serbia and the Balkans and what the Russians want in Serbia and the Balkans. I firmly believe that the Russians actually want instability in the region, because they, I think, rightly assume that if Serbia does become a part of some sort of a confrontation, either with Bosnia or with Kosovo, that will be the end of Western aspirations for Serbia. EU integration process will be as good as that, and Serbian elite will have nowhere else to turn but to Moscow. And this tension, I think, is clearly seen in the way that Serbian government projects its power, so to say, in the region. Because you have a sort of a schizophrenic situation where Vučić, who's the leader, undisputed leader of the country, who absolutely controls his party, has a tremendous amount of influence over the media, so much so that it is really very difficult to see any of the pro-government newspapers or channels really say anything that is not closely coordinated with a lot of the people in power, especially the people around Vučić. But what's key here is that Vučić doesn't send messages that are very threatening. He rarely does that. It's happened, as Richard rightly points out, several times, most recently around the Kosovo border crisis. It is mostly the pro-Russian elements in government in Serbia that do that. Minister Vulin, who's as far right as they get, I think you'll be hard pressed to find anybody like Vulin even in Russia these days. He's a Zhirinovsky type of character. I think that's the closest politician in Russia you can compare him to. And then there are people like Mr. Stefanovic, who was the Minister of Defense, who I think, together with Vulin and together with cadres of the Socialist Party of Serbia, are sort of a counterbalance to Vučić in government. They don't do it openly, but I think a lot of their statements are not necessarily pre-approved. I know there's a lot of people who disagree with me on this, but I think that there is a pro-Russian faction within the government that is, and I don't think Chinese have that. I think Chinese, that's the difference between China and Russia also. I think Chinese solely rely on their projects and their investment to wield influence. Russia has a tremendously extensive network of agents, allies, and projects in Serbia, frankly, from, as Richard said, the Serbian Orthodox Church, to people who, for example, they're most high profile, in my view, I don't know what to call them, an ally, let me just be mild, is the famous movie director from Bosnia, from Sarajevo, Mr. Emir Kusturica, who was present at dinner that Putin had with Michael Flynn, if you remember, in 2015. That's, part of US history now, the photo where he sits with Jill Stein and Michael Flynn. Kusturica is actually, I think, to Putin's left, right? And then Kusturica's wife is next. So Kusturica has come out and actually supported the protests against Vucic's government that were around the issue of extraction of precious metals in the west of Serbia. So I think there is a tension between Vucic and the Russians. And he has done a masterful job in the last 6-7 years of really opening up a sort of a bidding war between the West, the Chinese, and the Russians for where Serbia is going to turn. So you have, the US is also caught up in this. But I think Biden is not, despite the fact that I was very critical of what Biden did in the last year, I think that the reality we live today in Serbia, but especially in the whole Western Balkans, has to do with decisions made in Berlin in late 2005 when CDU and Merkel seized power. They made a strategic decision that Serbia, even before Vucic, this is including the previous government, was going to be the linchpin of the German strategy in the region, and Serbia was going to be promoted to the head of the pack in terms of European integration process. And this was a way also to cooperate with Russia closely, to appease Russia. We've seen this now, in Ukraine, throughout Eastern Europe, this German strategy of trying to cut deals with Russians anywhere that they can. So sort of to appease, to feed the beast in Moscow in many ways, and to try to to keep the continent as stable as possible. But I'd say that what often gets lost in a lot of these discussions is that Vucic caters, I don't think he's a unique figure. I think he caters to what the Serbian voters really want. I think we're talking about, and I think he will win between 50 and 60% of the vote in the first round. There's a near consensus among pollsters that he will win in the first round this time on Sunday, during Sunday's election. That he really tries to appease the West by, for example, voting in the UN, which surprised majority of observers. Serbia actually voted against Russia at the UN General Assembly. And also helping the West, helping the Americans in particular, create a new governing coalition in Montenegro without really, publicly putting his fingerprints on it. But it was more than apparent that Vucic actually delivered the new government, in my view, of Montenegro to the Americans, especially this US diplomat Escobar, who was the US envoy for the region. So we're in a very, I think the people, a lot of the observers, believe that after the election, pressure on Vucic will increase for a number of reasons, including the absolutely unexplainable procurement of arms, his ambiguous relationships with the far-right figures in Serbia, especially the media scene that, the tabloids are absolutely, in Serbia, are absolutely deranged. I highly advise people who don't follow this to actually take a look at some of this stuff. It is absolutely, I think nothing like that exists even in Russia. So it is a highly polluted, especially tabloid scene. But I think Vucic will have a period of time after he wins this election, which is very likely, where he's going to be able to entertain offers from the West, from Moscow, even from China, and decide where he wants to go. So I think we're bound to be even more frustrated with how the West approaches the region, because apparently Biden's strategy, and there's a new ambassador in town in Belgrade who arrived today, a high-profile ambassador, Mr. His name escapes me now. Tanya knows who I'm talking about. Richard does too. Actually, no, Chris Hill, who's a very, very well-known U.S. diplomat. And we'll see only once Hill starts making the rounds in Belgrade, we'll see what the real U.S. policy is in this case. So I would highly advise everybody that makes decisions, especially in Washington, because a lot of people who follow FPRI are very closely connected to Washington policy-making circles. to not consider Serbia as the only country in the region that really matters. I think each of the countries deserves to have the kind of support that Serbian government has enjoyed in the last 15 or 16 years, especially governments in Montenegro, Kosovo, and Bosnia, which I think are in many ways held hostage by the cultural and the political dynamic that we see within Serbia. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Reuf, thank you so much. I have so many questions for all three of you, but let me turn it over
Richard,
to
Richard, just Richard, don't touch your, when you talk, don't touch your, because your microphone is somewhere down there.
Let me turn it over to Dr. Tanya Domi. Thank you.
A little correction there. I'm not a doctor yet, but I'll be working.
Professor.
Professor, thank you so much. And I want to thank FPRI for organizing this event. I want to congratulate Richard on this incredibly comprehensive report. I'm not sure I've ever seen in all my years of reviewing publications, I've not seen such a comprehensive report, and I think it comes at a pivotal moment. And I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Reuf Bajrovic, for his most recent piece that was published by FPRI. I can't disagree with anything that's been said, and I will actually kind of steer my comments to rule of law. And there's no question that Serbia, as Richard has pointed out, is in a really, I think, a lockdown, the most oppressive media environment in the Balkans. And that yields to other issues related to rule of law. There's just a lack of accurate information, and the manipulation of state media has been going on for decades. And I use a case in point, a colleague who now works in Sarajevo, who runs a disinformation project there. She grew up in Belgrade during the war. She had no idea what happened in Bosnia. And she was invited to a seminar in Bosnia, went there, began to understand what happened, returned home, packed her bags, and moved to Sarajevo to help Bosnia. And I can just say to you that it is so clear. I mean, this goes all the way back to Tito, of course, Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, but then it yields to the rise of Milosevic. And state-controlled media is as the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's just there. And so this is really a threat. It is the canary in the mine that's been there for a long time. But I would submit to you that, as Richard and Reuf have pointed out, Serbia is about the edges. It's not on the margins of doing whatever just gets it to the next point in time. There's no serious commitment with regard to rule of law on chapters 23 and 24 for accession into the EU. Those are the major judiciary and rule of law chapters, and they have done minimal effort. It's more performative than anything else, and there is no commitment by the government to stop political influence of judges. So there's just really no rule of law. I will add in one of the national war crimes courts, 3 of which, one in Croatia, one in Bosnia, and one in Serbia, per the Dayton Peace Accords. That prosecutor announced a few years ago that she would only bring cases against Serbian victims. And Mr. Vučić made promises to the Obama administration that he would bring the perpetrator of the execution of the Batici brothers to justice, and that individual remains in the cabinet of the Progressives Party. So there's really no follow through here. They barely meet the low bar. And as Richard points out, their 2 close allies now are indeed Russia and China, neither of whom have any commitment to rule of law. And as a matter of fact, Russia is the most lawless state of Europe. It has more than 200 judgments against it at the European Court of Human Rights, and with impunity. And the other concern I continue to have is this enormous fiscal financial partnership with China, estimated by Serbian Monitor. It could be anywhere from 8 billion up to 15 billion, because there's no transparency on these projects, and money and more than likely kickbacks going to Serbian politicians. What kind of payoff does Serbia have to yield to in this partnership with China? That's my big concern. And of course, I want to watch the UN Security Council and what is going on there, although sadly, they are probably the most irrelevant institution at this moment during the greatest crisis facing the world since the end of World War II, which is regrettable. But there's got to be a payoff, and it will come in the Human Rights Council in Geneva and in institutions like that. I would also say there has been absolutely not one iota of an effort to own up to the atrocities of their past, and their refusal to do so has yielded to genocide denial with respect to both Bosnia and Kosovo. Their refusal to acknowledge responsibility holds all Serbs accountable, which is wrong. These are crimes carried out by government officials. Historically, Mr. Vučić himself was a spokesperson for Mr. Milosevic. He knows what happened. He most recently denied that Mr. Milosevic had anything to do with the genocide and the killings in Bosnia, which is just patently outrageous, given all the legal jurisprudence that was generated in the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and their refusal to acknowledge responsibility as well. In Kosovo, only one woman has won a case against her rape assailant in Kosovo. No justice there, and with no justice, there is no peace. And I have empathy for Kosovo because their grievances are real and tangible and documented, and there's no acknowledgement of that. So to hold that line does not yield to peace, in my view. And as has been pointed out by my colleagues, there's just no effort to really own up to Western values. And so I see that there's a question about, well, if the people don't have Western values, the people really don't have a choice. They've been fed propaganda for decades. And we should give some props to the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, which has issued a report about this weekend's elections, calling out 4 different war criminals, including Shechel, who are running for office again. This too shows their lack of respect in regard for the rule of law. So I'm going to leave my comments there, but it's very clear to me that Russia and China are probably the 2 worst regimes in the world when it comes, 2 of the worst regimes in the world when it comes to rule of law, and Belgrade is very close to both of those regimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Domi. I think it's so important that each of you pointed out the importance of the media space, the shrinking media space, but also the importance of disinformation. I think it's so much easier to underestimate the value of this until you get to a point like what we have with Russia and Ukraine. FPRI is about to publish an article that talks about Russian perceptions of the war in Ukraine and just to what degree the disinformation and propaganda has worked domestically in Russia, and how that has been translated into this overwhelming support or indifference towards the war in Ukraine, and less so in outrage. So what we're learning right now, more than anything, is how propaganda works. Long-term closing down of free information space in the long term works. So we should not underestimate the value of the information space challenges that each of you have touched upon. I want to ask a question that has come in quite a bit, and I think it's a question on everyone's minds. It's a very difficult question, I understand, but I feel like this is the group that could offer some answers, which is what should be the West's response? Richard touched on this just a little bit, saying, return on investment is important. I'm assuming that also includes quite a bit of conditionality, aid conditionality that you would probably propose. This is also outlined in your report, but I want to ask each of you, what should be the West response here, especially if the April 3rd presidential and general elections go in favor of the existing government? I'll start with Richard.
Thank you for that. Yes, as acknowledged, I addressed that a little bit at the end, that there needs to be a firmer sense of conditionality, a stronger tone when agreements aren't met. I think Tanya's analysis that's sort of like, we'll do just enough. It's like, yeah, there isn't follow through. I think that's absolutely spot on. Look, when when I was back in 2020, late 2020, I was doing, looking back I'm also a fellow at the European Values Center in Prague, and wrote our Balkan review for the year. It's interesting, like, just as a great example, the amount of money, not just in terms of insistence, but also business that comes from the EU going into Serbia, powers huge parts of their economy, financial and political support in the hope that Serbia becomes more democratic and a more responsible member of the community, if you will. And, China shows up. They had something like, they gave in March, they show up, they gave some protective gear. I think they had 4 doctors and maybe a handful of medical assistants and a handful of ventilators, all right? And then all over the place are these banners talking about how Xi is the greatest friend of Serbia that anyone could imagine, all right? You don't see that stuff for EU. Serbs don't know the extent to which the United States actually cares about them and wants their country to be democratic and wants to see it on a trajectory that is pointing westward rather than towards these authoritarians in Moscow and in Beijing. And essentially, as I've been arguing for a long time, watching these authoritarian trending leaders show up in various capitals throughout Central and Southeastern Europe, like, you don't get to have your cake and eat it too. And having said all of that, the West is in a very difficult position. There have been some, since the war began in Ukraine, reading in Serbian media, I think it was Dacic who was talking about, like, look, basically saying that if we go after Russia and we alienate them, like, we're going to lose Kosovo. Now, we can argue that point, but it's a perception, and I think it's one that that shines a little bit of light on the hard space that they're in. Unfortunately, I think Vučić leverages the complexities of balancing these relationships, obviously for his own benefit, so that he and his party can stay in power. If it's not, if you're not getting the results that you paid for, if you will, well, then you need to have a sit-down conversation about why those results aren't being realized. And then if they aren't, you have to start moving elsewhere. It makes no sense to empower someone who's behaving in an increasingly authoritarian manner with political and financial support to the detriment of our own long-term interests.
Thank you. Reuf?
So the mother of all questions. The West certainly has to start treating Serbia like one of the equal partners in the Western Balkans region. So giving preferential treatment to Serbia is what led us to where we are now. I'm afraid that that is not what the strategy is in Brussels. And what we've seen from Biden White House so far is that they also think that if they quote unquote fix Serbia, that they can do really well in the rest of the region. So I think that countries like Kosovo, like Bosnia, like Montenegro, like Macedonia, deserve to be treated equally and have the same kind of attention devoted to them. For example, Bosnia wasn't invited to the summit for democracy. I mean, which is one of Serbia was, which is, in my view, one of the most ridiculous decisions in the Balkans for a long, long time. I mean, that just makes zero sense. But it was done, and it is because there's this courting of Serbia, courting of Vučić, that is, it is just incredibly, I think, frustrating for people in Kosovo and for people in Bosnia and for people in Montenegro. Hence, this Open Balkan project, which is in a way, it's. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of the project, but it's certainly seen by many in the region as being Belgrade-centric. Now, there's something very sad that we must accept, which is that Vučić's opposition, the people who are running against him, and this is his major strength, I think, are to the right of him. So you have the people who are trying to unseat him, the major political alliances that are now running in Serbia, are essentially accusing Vučić of betraying Russia, betraying Kosovo. They say very nice things about war criminals like Ratko Mladić and so on. And this gives him incredible leverage vis-a-vis the West. And it is really hard to see how, unless there's a concerted effort by the West to support pro-democracy, pro-reconciliation, pro-West forces in Serbia, in the medium term, how there can be any change. Because we're essentially dealing with Vučić and the far-right version of Vučić in this election. There's a list that's fairly centrist, which has very little political potential at the moment. And it is because the West has decided that all of their cards are really on Vučić. They've put all their chips on Vučić, and I think they'll be rewarded on Sunday, but it will be a very long slog until they finally realize that even hypothetically, even if the strategy were to succeed, problems in Bosnia still have a lot to do with Bosnia. It's a Dodik, who we haven't talked about enough, is a Russian proxy, independent of what Vučić's relationship is with Moscow. So even if you were to get Vučić hypothetically on your side, you're not going to fix the Dodik problem. You're not going to fix the Montenegro government ruling majority problem, which is extremely pro-Russian, pro-Putin. You're not going to change the problems of non-recognition of Kosovo. So I think a reckoning will come, but I'm sad to say this. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're now at a junction where the West hopes that they'll get something out of Vučić after the election, and it'll take a few years before they realize that that's not the way to fix the region. But one final point I'm going to make is that in all these years, we have not paid enough attention, in my view, to how the legacy of the war has completely been erased. It has been evacuated from the analysis. And that's why I think what Tanya said is exceptionally important. We don't talk about the fact that nobody's been really seriously charged for the siege of Sarajevo. Massive crimes in Kosovo have, they haven't been forgotten, but they have been sort of put aside. And you have this new special court that's in The Hague, that's a court that only deals with Albanian war crimes, which I think is absolutely unacceptable. But that's where we are now. So the West has gone all in on trying to appease Serbia, and I'm very happy to say that the war in Ukraine has made Serbs in general, not only Serbia, but Serbs in general, much less likely to resort to violence, because the performance of the Russian army has been so abysmal. And you keep in mind that most of the stuff that Serbia, military equipment that Serbia has, is, either Russian or very close to what the Russians have, and the way that they wage war is actually very similar. Because the tactics we see in Ukraine of besieging cities and killing civilians using indiscriminate shelling is something that Mladić did in Bosnia in the 90s. So I think Serbs are not there's no appetite for conflict at this moment in time. So I think that's the good news.
Thank you, Reuf. You actually answered another one of the audience questions that kept coming in. I want to turn the same question over to Professor Domi, but let me tack on another question to this. We've spoken so much about this need for the Serbs to have a different national narrative, to come to terms with the legacy of the war. Reuf, may I ask you to mute yourself? Thank you. The coming to terms with the legacy of the war, but also addressing these extreme issues with the rule of law. I want to ask Professor Domi to tell us, what are some of the Western-led mechanisms or efforts that you have found to be effective in this regard? What are some of the easily deployable instruments that can go towards this effort? Although it seems like there are no plans right now for the West to change its approach to Serbia.
Well, as somebody has noted in the chat from the audience, that Chris Hill, the U.S. ambassador, arrived at Belgrade today. Chris Hill is somebody that I know. He was part of the Holbrooke constellation of diplomats during the war and leading up to and the post-war period in the Balkans. He is a no-nonsense kind of guy. His speech is quite discreet and economic, and he does not play around. This is an interesting type of diplomat to send to Belgrade at this moment. Now, it'll be interesting to watch him begin to engage with the government, and he's going to have to develop a relationship with Vučić. I don't know what his orders are or how much he negotiated to be able to push Serbia, because as Ralph has pointed out, the United States has certainly not pushed since Biden came to power. And, they've done more than that. They've kind of held his hand and patted him on the back in ways that I just think are counterproductive. And so it will be interesting to see how Hill, begins to address all these shortcomings that we've been talking about. And does he have the authority to really push? And I would say, given everything that I know about U.S. foreign policy at this point, and just yesterday I did a podcast with an expert on the Middle East, the United States is not looking to initiate much of anything beyond let's just be stable, let's maintain the relationship. You don't see any effort or any interest rather in engaging in any kind of diplomatic effort to address major problems in the Middle East and certainly not in the Balkans. So what mechanisms have worked? It's sad to say this, but the EU has many of those mechanisms because Serbia is located in Europe, and the EU hasn't used their toolbox very effectively, in my view. I believe that, a sustained effort to back civil society is really important. There are some very brave people in Belgrade, in Serbia, doing brave work. And it's very hard to be in the shadow of that government for over 25, 30 years. And many of them have left. One superlative lawyer advocate, Sandra Orlovich, is now in Baghdad helping with the Iraqi parliament to prosecute ISIS fighters who raped and enslaved Yazidi women. Goran Milicic, a top human rights lawyer who's the director of civil rights defenders, a Swedish-backed NGO. He's the European director and now lives in Stockholm and comes to Belgrade, every month to do his work. It is very hard to be a civil society leader in this country, and the EU needs to step up along with the United States, to fund and to back and to really support these NGOs, because as far as I'm concerned, they're the last line in Serbia between what is expected of democratic states and the line crossing it into authoritarianism. And that's why I remain very concerned about the media environment, because that goes hand in hand. With regard to the relationship with Kosovo, we actually, in my recent article on we have to find a different way to prosecute sex crimes during conflict, we're suggesting and recommending, following on the opinions of American University law professor Paul Williams, that the Kosovo Specialist Chamber should be opened up more broadly to prosecute all war crimes that took place beyond the KLA, quote unquote, figures. And the reason why so little justice has been attained, because ICTY ended its mandate after many, many years. So only 6 people were prosecuted before ICTY ended its mandate that were involved in crimes in Kosovo. So that's a huge omission. And the EU under Dick Marty set the parameters of that prosecution. That needs to be revisited and reopened. And so that's one of my opinions. So double down and provide funding and support to civil society. The accountability mechanisms are, I think, it's going to be challenging to do this. Serbia has every right as a sovereign nation to align itself with whomever they want, but there should be consequences for that. And I just want to say, this is intrinsic to what I'm talking about right now. A lot of people in Europe and around the world were shocked by the demonstration in Belgrade in support of Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine. And I was not, absolutely not. Upcoming, and this is intrinsic to human rights, is that Goran Milicic has organized and secured, after several years, European Pride that is supposed to take place in September in Belgrade. And I think that many people are probably concerned about the safety environment there, and just actually, is it appropriate for people to go when this is really becoming a pariah state, in my view. So there should be consequences, but that requires European leadership, European diplomats to change now from their recent behavior to becoming, saying this is what it's going to take, and you need to step up. And the United States in partnership, and also I would add that the United Kingdom is very important to this process, and they are now back engaged, and I don't think there could be a better development in the region with their presence as well. That's my comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Domi. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to ask one last question to Richard. I think Reuf and Professor Domi both have touched upon the war in Ukraine. So I want to go to Richard with this. Richard, how do you see the implications of the war in Ukraine, let's say, on overall the Western Balkans, the perceptions of it? Like Professor Domi said, we've seen some support for it even. What's your take on the impact of the Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine?
Wow, that's the last question. Let me count the ways. Yeah, throughout the region, Russia is very much on track to being a pariah state, and as long as it continues in that route, the ramifications of the decisions being made in the Kremlin in this regard are tremendous. I think it's tragic that it came to this. regrettably, I'm not surprised that this is where we are. The extent of the invasion there was who would have thought, right? How this would have gone, the siege of Mariupol, basically like ethnic Russians shooting at their cousins across the border. It's insane. What I've been seeing in the region, at least in effective public opinion, that even in Bulgaria, which has also had its own unique historical relationship with Russia, friends of mine who are journalists there have shared with me that in the first couple of weeks, you didn't really there was still a lot of public support, or at least somewhat sympathy for Putin and for Russians. And as the war progresses, you just watch it start to go like this. I would point out that they have free and open media space, not one in Serbia. So that's one example of how, what we're seeing in the region is that where there is free and independent media, there is honest reporting, that public opinion is turning against Russia. Obviously less so at Serbia. And I'm with Tanya. Like, I wasn't surprised by that parade. Anything but. Throughout the region, I also agree with Reuf's analysis. I think this is fortunately a collateral benefit has been it's put a damper on the prospect of using violence as a means to achieve political change in the region. The West's united response against Russia and its violations of Ukrainian sovereignty have been thus far strong and forceful. I would like to see them stronger and more forceful, but I think the message is being understood in the Balkans that, like, look, if they're going to do this on Russia, well, what happens if we go ahead and start a war for, some greater idea about how, our ethnic group deserves more land than others who are already occupying it? It's tamped that down. Also for the region, and this is directly in respect to Serbia, the impact is that lines are being drawn, and people are being increasingly asked, which side are you going to be on? And right now, what we've seen so far coming out of Serbia, because this will of course impact the region, but on one hand, there's, as Reuf noted, there was the condemnatory vote in the UN. President Vučić has also publicly not supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I noticed that they always couch it in terms of territorial integrity. And territorial integrity is very often part of these statements. And I believe that is because it's Serbia trying to tell Russia that, no, this is really because we're concerned about Kosovo. If we get on board and we talk about territorial changes, that might negatively impact our position vis-a-vis Pristina. And so, they've couched it in terms that they may be condemnatory, but in a specific way. I would also point out that, the flights from Belgrade to Moscow since EU airspace was closed have doubled, and that Air Serbia has actually been using even larger planes in order to supplement. So he's still doing it. He's still trying to play both sides of the coin, and that will get him through the election, I think. But once the election's over, should those in the West want to pursue the more kind of tough love approach that we're advocating here, I think Vučić is going to have a very hard time. And the image of him that he's sought so hard to cultivate as this extremely deft political operator that's able to manage these different powers and the extent that they want to engage in Serbia, he's going to have a real hard time preserving that. And my hope is that eventually, at some point, if a new government in Belgrade continues to be recalcitrant and decide that their interests rest with Russia and China, then you know what? We're moving on.
Thank you, Richard. This was such an enlightening discussion, and there are two big takeaways that I want sort of people to take home as food for thought. One, I'm noticing that, especially when you're not a Western Balkans expert, our failure, the West's failure, or the international community's failure to properly carry out these war crimes prosecutions after so many years does not instill a lot of confidence in us that there will be justice for Ukraine one day, or that there will be swift justice for Ukraine, because a huge part of this war in Ukraine is particularly the war crimes situation. So this is very disappointing, but can we think about, are there things we can do to change this track record and to improve our approach to war crimes prosecutions? The second one, looking at the region overall and US policy, especially US policy towards the greater sort of Eurasia region, Central and Eastern Europe, I'm noticing again this very frustrating pattern that we seem to be just approaching it as don't ruffle any feathers, don't make any major changes to your policies, and just stick to the status quo. This is doing huge disservice to countries like Georgia, actually, where we have some very similar challenges. I'm astonished at how many statements you guys have made. Just swap out the country name to Georgia and it applies, and it's not just Georgia, right? So there too, we need to really rethink what we are doing. Are we doing a disservice to these countries and to these societies by just sticking to the status quo? So these are just a couple of thoughts that I hope our audience walks away with. I really want to thank each of you, Richard Kraemer, Reuf Bajrovic, and Professor Tanya Domi. The conversation continues on FPRI.org. We'll have many more articles and reports on these issues, and I certainly hope the three of you will join me again for continued discussion. Thank you to our audience members. If you're not already, please join FPRI, become our members and supporters. Of course, follow us on social media and sign up for our emails. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Maya. Rev, Tanya, thank you, everyone.
Hey, thanks, everybody. It was really good. Thanks.